Awesome, and thank you so much.
Yeah.
So my name is Lisa Doseff, my husband Dave, and I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, and I'm delighted to hear that you're doing a whole series on creation care. So today I'm going to talk to you about healthy, happy habitats, which for me means engaging children in creating wildlife habitat. So we moved to Lancaster 9 years ago, and to be near our grandchildren, we had 6 at the time, now we have 10 here. And so it's been delightful. And we had a very traditional yard with a lot of lawn and not many trees and shrubs. And so what we've done is we've turned it into a wildlife sanctuary. And we had great horned owls and fox, all kinds of things, just in this little half acre that we own. So the fox actually lives somewhere else on the block. But anyway, so let's go ahead and get started. And I also just want to point out, these are native plants that are blooming in my yard right now. And I have a succession of blooms. So if I were to come talk in another month, I'd have a whole different set of plants, but they'd be just as beautiful. So a lot of people, so my whole premise of this is using native plants and doing it with children. So let's get started. So gardening and being with my grandkids are 2 of my favorite pastimes, and I just love combining the 2. So I have a great desire to share my love of nature. So not only so that they can enjoy it, but also so that they'll appreciate that we're all part of a bigger picture. And I want them to understand why it's so important for their grandfather and I to restore habitat, and to encourage them to share that goal. And together we convert our garden into a suburban oasis for all kinds of critters. I figured the best way to do this was to show them how much fun it can be and to learn and to play in nature. And my hope is that they will become, if unwittingly, I'm so sorry, my voice is catching. I have allergies today and I'm just like, I forgot everything. Thoughtful stewards of our natural world. But before we continue, there are a few things I want to tell you about myself. I am not an expert on anything. So I'm not a botanist, horticulturalist, entomologist, or behavior scientist. But as a former Virginia Master Gardener and current Lancaster National Wildlife Federation habitat steward, I have an excellent appreciation for all the mistakes I've made in my garden. So there are lots of lessons in humility. I often forget the names of plants, not only in Latin, but sometimes even their common names. And our garden's a trial and error garden. Our experiments to attract wildlife often have to be rethought. But if we find something's not working, we try to figure out what went wrong, regroup, and forge ahead what we believe is going to be a terrific new plan. So we have a lot of fun, and we happen to like the way it's coming along, and more importantly, how it functions for wildlife. So I found that enthusiasm and persistence are more than a match for gardening mistakes. What I do have is a great joy for gardening with kids, paired with a keen desire to improve our environment. And I'm hoping to share some of that with you this morning. Before I get into the how we did it, I'd like to take a few minutes first to try to make the case for why it's important to have children participate in this activity. I'm going to take a break from my normal slideshow here because this is usually for a secular audience. For me, it was a calling. I very much feel like we should be good stewards of God's earth. And so I try to find out the best ways to do this. And so really it's my faith that led me down the path of gardening with natives and so on. So habitats being lost at an alarming rate, and climate change is a current threat. The World Wildlife Federation states that there's been a 72% decrease in wildlife between 1970 and now. And the Xerces Society says that insects have decreased by 50% during that time period. I'm sure there are some of you that can remember when you couldn't drive without getting bugs on your windshield. And I bet some of you younger folks have really never experienced that. According to the Cornell Ornithology Lab, bird numbers have plummeted by 30%, or 3 billion breeding adult birds. And so we need to increase habitat for these animals, and also for the survival of our own species. Children can't love and miss what they don't know. I think of all the unstructured time I spent playing outdoors in nature as a child. And today's youth just seem to have busier schedules, and there are so many fewer wild places for them to explore. So I really long for them to have greater contact with the natural world. And wouldn't it be wonderful if they could all find it right outside their own doors? Children are our hope for the future. They're ultimately the people who are going to ensure that our world becomes a more eco-friendly home for all of its inhabitants. We ourselves may not live long enough to see all the changes that need to take place. To support the path along our hopes and dreams, as well as any skills and knowledge that we might have to the children in our lives, so they can carry this movement forward. Our planet really needs their participation, and it needs them now. According to Richard Loeb, who wrote Last Child in the Woods, children who spend time outdoors in nature are healthier physically, spiritually, and emotionally. They suffer less from depression, anxiety, ADHD, and obesity, and they have improved test scores and grade point averages. Plus, they're better at problem solving and creativity. It also seems to me that when children share the purpose and goal of increasing natural habitat, that instead of simply worrying about environmental issues, which has recently been labeled eco-anxiety, and it's been recognized as a real psychological issue, it allows them to be actively engaged in the solution to a real problem. This involvement empowers them to have a say in, as well as a very positive impact on, the future of their own physical and mental health, and the future health of God's creation. My hope and dream is that environmental education will be a core part of every school's curriculum. But until that happens, it's really up to those of us concerned about the welfare of God's creation to carry the torch. And to be honest, one of my desires is that as with some other movements, children will actually have an influence on adults. I think of when I was a child in the 60s and many people smoked. But when my siblings and I learned about the hazards of smoking and went to my dad who smoked a pipe and told him about it, he actually stopped smoking. And finally, restoring habitat with kids is really just a lot of fun. They delight in playing in the dirt and unlocking all kinds of nature's secrets. And we're constantly amazed at what they teach us as we discover the world anew through their young eyes. Okay, so there's the why we should have kids participate in habitat restoration. And now let's go to the how. I'm going to take you on the journey of I'm going to take you on how we did it in our own yard, in our own garden. And I hope to show how you can not only attract wildlife and delight the children in your life, but just as importantly, please the neighbors. Because if the neighbors like what they see, they're much more likely to try it. And if they don't like what they see, they're just going to be saying, what a messy yard you have. So we bought a house in Lancaster with a traditional garden landscape, much like all the others on our street, that consisted mostly of lawn, a few foundation plants, and quite a number of lovely but invasive species, which I call femme fatales. So keep this picture in mind, because later on you're going to see how we transformed our front yard here. But also growing there were some magnificent old white pines at the back of our property, and native ash, cherry, and hackberry trees along the borders with the neighbors. So we were really literally ready to dig in and increase habitat for wildlife. So I'm going to start by reviewing elements that the National Wildlife Federation says are necessary to create habitat for wildlife. And those are food, water, cover, places to raise young, and sustainable practices. But Garden with Wildlife with Kids also puts a premium on 3 additional elements that make success much more realistic: patience, flexibility, and a sense of humor. Patience, because it's going to take you longer to help the kids discover and explore how to do things and to find the answers for themselves than it is to simply give them a to-do list and a ready response to a question. And they may not be able to dig or plant as fast as you and I can. I usually start by asking questions like, how do you think we can get salamanders to visit our garden? And I let them make suggestions. While it might be a good thing to gently guide them to a solution that you know is going to work, don't be afraid to let them try something that you know is not going to work, because so many valuable lessons are learned that way. However, you might be astonished that they find an innovative idea that you hadn't even thought of yourself. And you need to have flexibility to allow them to be in on the planning as well. When they're allowed to have a voice in implementing the restoration of habitat, they see themselves as a key part of the process. which actually spurs them on to suggest other interesting ideas and to take ownership or even the lead on a project. And keep a sense of humor because the ideas they come up with and the way they work can be extremely entertaining and they can get pretty darn silly. They also say and do the darndest things, so just enjoy it. So let's start with the first step. Before we could increase habitat, we had to remove a huge amount of invasive ground covers that we'd inherited. English ivy, bindweed, bishop's weed, big bat, and Asian pachysandra. And there were also quite a number of invasive shrubs. It was a huge task, but as we like to say, you can eat an elephant one bite at a time. We were able to take out most of these species by hand pulling, but I'll confess that after years of hand pulling, I finally had to resort to spraying the bindweed and the bishop's weed with Roundup. When we pulled it, it only increased the spread and nothing else would kill it. So, but I really want to say, please try not to use chemicals around children. Well, don't use them around children and try not to use them at all. If I had it to do over again, I'd now use horticultural vinegar. But if you use chemicals and even the vinegar, it's often hazardous to the very wildlife that you're trying to protect. Once most of the invasive species were removed, we were able to begin restoring a natural habitat by beginning with plants. So planting is really just a lot of fun for everyone. And this is how we planned our native natural habitat home. Getting back to the National Wildlife Federation habitat elements, we started with the element of food. The best way to start to create habitat, of course, is by planting the native plants that our wildlife rely upon. Native plants will draw the insects that feed the birds and other wildlife and provide the leaves, nuts, seeds, berries, pollen, and nectar for a variety of animals. This is the key to restoring habitat. It's sort of a modified field of dreams approach. If you feed them, they will come. Many children know that monarchs need milkweed, but they're unaware that so many other species of butterflies and insects are plant specialists too. Like the zebra swallowtail that will only eat the leaves of pawpaws, or the great spangled fritillary butterfly, which I saw this week actually, that only lays its eggs and eats the leaves of violets. And we make a fun activity of comparing native and non-native species by looking for evidence of insect and wildlife activity in our yard. A fun game we play is to see who can find the leaves with the most nibbled edges or holes in them. And they get really excited by this little treasure hunt. But it's really just a sneaky way to teach host plants to the kids. It's good, of course, for them to understand that the invasive plants are detrimental to our environment because they outcompete with the native plants that are so essential and that God intended to be here in the first place. During the first fall of the coronavirus, I was walking with my 3-year-old granddaughter who remarked how beautiful the red burning bush was. And I said, well, it might be beautiful, but it's really not a good plant. And she goes, why? Does it have COVID? Now, look at the blueberries we planted that year. On the right are blueberry bushes from my neighbor's garden. Mine aren't quite that big yet. So not only do they have the same gorgeous color as that invasive burning bush, but they have year-round interest. So in the spring, they're covered in these dainty little white bell-shaped flowers. In the summer, you get to eat blueberries. And then in the fall, they turn this color. And in the winter, they have these reddish, brownish branches. And boy, when it snows, they just stand out and they're just stunning. Plus, they're great for wildlife. You can also explain that while some native insects might enjoy the nectar of a non-native or invasive species like the butterfly bush, they're generally just covered in butterflies. It can be like serving them soda pop and candy. It may not have all the nutrients they need to survive and produce the next generation. And if they fill up on those things, just like kids who eat treats before dinner, they may not have the desire to go pollinate our native plants that are actually going to need them for fertilization and pollination. But even worse than being the equivalent of junk food, there are some species like the Asian pipevine that our native pipevine caterpillar is going to mistake for the real thing for our native pipevine, and it's toxic to them. So they'll eat it and they'll die. And So anyway, I know nobody intentionally plans to plant to kill off insects and so on, but we just unknowingly sometimes do that. So anyway, so speaking of food, we have to address predators and prey. Once you start planting and get to observe food web in action, you'll get to watch this happen. And it's easy to see how insects eat leaves and gather pollen and nectar from flowers, how birds eat caterpillars and worms, or how a spider spins its web and catches its prey. More dramatic is witnessing a hawk catching a bird like my grandson did last fall. And he ran inside excitedly and told us all about it and said it looked like the bird just exploded. And there were mockingbird feathers all over the driveway to prove it. It's also a launch pad for explaining how in a healthy ecosystem, everything's kept in balance. A key goal is to help them observe and discover the relationships between species. In our suburban yard, we've observed foxes with small rodents in their mouths, as well as owls and hawks carrying small mammals and birds in their talons. When we were at our grandkids' house one day, we actually watched this gang of turkey come through their yard and go back into the woods behind their house. And as if that weren't enough, then we watched this orange streak zip back and forth until it was a red fox and it finally captured one of the big birds. And the kids were absolutely fascinated. If you're concerned that this subject might make them squeamish, keep in mind that most kids are generally intrigued by ferocious dinosaurs, the Titanic, and trade routes. So talking about predators and prey is just another factual and captivating subject that really grabs their attention. And going back to this picture, you can explain how things like insecticides that kill the bugs affect all animals in an ecosystem. If the plant's leaves have insecticide, not only will it affect the caterpillar that eats it, but also the bird that eats the caterpillar and on up the food chain. So water is the second element needed. Adding water features to the garden with kids is a lot of fun. We have several bird baths, and putting the children in charge of filling them with fresh water is a chore that they really love to do. But I'm sure you can imagine the results of combining water and children. So in the summertime, I suggest that bathing suits are great garden attire. 2 summers ago, we installed a small pond where our downspout empties into the high end of the rain garden. It's very basic, no pump or filter, just a solar sprayer and to keep the water moving and a solar air bubbler and mosquito duns. I've mentioned we often make mistakes, and this project was one of the experiments that had to be reworked. In fact, we let the kids know at the outset of any project that everything we do is an experiment. And if it doesn't work, we're going to ask what went wrong and what can we do? And what did we learn? So in the case of this pond, we hadn't taken into consideration the fact that the low end of the pond actually had to be lower than the drain pipe that carried the runoff from our downspouts. And only then could the water continue to flow into the rain garden. So I'm sure if there are any right brain folks out there, they're probably snickering, but it's true. So we removed the rocks, dug down deeper, and made the adjustment. Was the first attempt a failure? Absolutely not. It's what we call a landscape engineering learning experience, and it won't be forgotten. And within only a few days, a wood frog decided it was a great spot for its daily sunning. We hoped to get tadpoles last year, but unfortunately that didn't happen. We think it was because in the spring we found the pond had algae, which led us to discover that by adding some barley straw to the water, it should clear it up in about a month. It did. So now we're hoping for tadpoles this year. Cover is the third element. Animals need places to hide from predators. So providing trees, shrubs, and perennials offers this protection, but so do logs and stones. So I'd like to take a minute to talk about planting with kids, since that's the basis of our garden. We've found the easiest way is to create a large garden bed. The process we use is called lasagna gardening or sheet mulching or composting in place. So this eliminates heavy digging, and it also creates a rich soil. We lay out a hose or rope where we'd like the bed to be. We dig around the perimeter to have just a little, like a little trench around the edges. And then we cover it with cardboard and newspapers, and they have to go down pretty thickly, like put the whole day's newspaper down. Don't just put a sheet or two. And then we top it with wood chips or a combination of your grass clippings, leaves, whatever you happen to have. And we let it lay fallow for 6 to 12 months. So after 6 months, you can plant shrubs and trees into it. And then, they can grow pretty well. And then after 12 months, you can add your perennials. And so this is really a good lesson for the kids. Having to be wait to plant lets them know that nature doesn't always grant instant gratification. And it's also a great opportunity for them to see decomposition at work. So, and that's all part of God's plan for how things should go, right? But once the bed is established, it really doesn't take long for the critters to arrive. These are all pictures of our garden. Oh, go back one day. There was the owl in the second photo that lives in our pines. He's actually sitting on the cherry tree by the pines. This is actually a Carolina mantis. So most people think the regular green Asian pin mantises are good. They're actually an invasive species and they kill hummingbirds and a lot of our beneficial insects. So, we try to remove those from the garden, but we were fortunate enough to have Carolina mantises. So anyway, so we have a holly right outside our kitchen window and the kids love to watch the birds take cover under the branches, especially on snowy winter days. And we built a brush pile out back with limbs we trimmed or that had blown down in storms. And just for fun, turning something like this, practical like this into an art project only enhances the fun for the children and the appeal of the garden. However, when the great horned owls decided to nest in the white pines above it, the brush pile that was intended to protect these little creatures actually became the owl's cafeteria buffet. So it's sometimes hard to know what to pay for. So we simply let nature take its place, take its course, and enjoy observing the interaction between the predators and prey. Places to raise young is the fourth element. Simply having kids plant native trees, shrubs, and perennials in your yard will provide plenty of spaces for them to lay eggs, some species of birds to nest, and mammals and reptiles and amphibians to find a home. Putting up bird houses is a great way for them to easily be able to observe nest making, feeding, and the fledging of a bird family. So there are different types of bird houses, and finding out what each species of birds like will help you put up a house that's more likely to become occupied. Putting out nesting materials for the birds is fun, and if you put in some scraps of biodegradable yarn or fabric, you might find those pieces woven into the nests in your yard. That's really, kind of a thing for the kids. If you don't cut back the stalks of your native plants, you'll also be able to teach them how insects overwinter in the stems of plants. And they can collect seeds and observe plant material being gathered by birds for food or nesting material in the spring. Laying logs and putting down stones provides a moist habitat for salamanders, toads, and a variety of insects and other animals. And while we actually do have a red fox that runs through our yard, our brush pile is more likely to shelter bunnies. So on the left, I don't know if you can see our little fox friend. This is taken from, this is that holly tree, and this is taken from our kitchen window. The low stone wall has become a home to chipmunks, and critter condos and bee hotels are easy and fun to make, and they provide housing opportunities for some of our smaller wildlife friends. So sustainable practices is the fifth element. And what do we mean by sustainable practices? We want a garden that's going to be easy to maintain in our case. And we want it to be something that provides for wildlife and at the same time doesn't require a lot of care. So the goal of restoring the habitat in our garden was to put in a variety of native plants that are the basis of the food web and allow nature to unfold without having to fuss a lot with it. When necessary, we use integrated pest management to remove invasive species of bugs. And here we were a few years back putting up a trap for the spotted lanternflies. The rain garden was easily created by simply adding a berm to a really low, soggy spot behind the garage where the downspout collected water from the roof. And this helps mitigate stormwater runoff. And it turned into this really lush oasis of native plants. Our property consisted almost entirely of lawn when we bought it. And where a lawn might provide space for playing soccer or football, there are plenty of parks and schoolyards in our community where the kids can do that. But if you reduce your lawn, you can still improvise and play short croquet or mini baseball like our grandkids are doing here. But in our yard, it's not the games that the kids are most interested in playing. They come over and they immediately start running through the paths and garden rooms, and they each find a favorite spot. Now, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about what the neighbors think. Remember the picture of the house when we bought it? This is what it looks like today. Can you have it all? Curb appeal, a great place for kids to play and explore, and a pollinator and wildlife-friendly garden? Of course you can. And I don't know if you see it, this is even a little fort we built back there. So it's hidden, the trees there are much bigger, so now it's even hidden more. So you can really just make a garden that appeals to everybody. So in our natural habitat garden, we have areas for entertaining friends, as well as play places tucked away behind beautiful plants that provide food and cover for wildlife. And I'll address that non-native Japanese maple right by the front door in a few minutes. As I mentioned before, if your garden is attractive, it may inspire the neighbors to try to increase habitat in their own gardens. So just a few years after we began this adventure, one of my neighbors told me, "We love what you've done, and there are so many more birds here in the neighborhood now." And invite the neighbors in to explore your garden. When people walking down the street comment on our garden, I briefly explain about restoring habitat, and I offer them to come on a garden tour. But I know sometimes my explanations are not brief enough because David, if he's with me, he'll start going. Anyway, but I really do believe it can affect change. And last fall, when I was walking through the garden with my 4-year-old granddaughter, giving a tour to an ecologist that had come out to see it, she took over the tour and she started explaining about the pond, the butterfly puddle, the bird dust bath. And she was just really delighted to be able to share with this person all that she knew about the garden she loves. So signage will let folks know what's going on and hopefully get them to consider rethinking their gardens. And there are already a couple of young families on our block who are now turning their own yards into wildlife habitats. And also some of the older folks are beginning to do it too. So I'm really just thrilled to see this happen. And some people who have stopped by have joined our Gardens Gone Native Club, which a friend and I started here in Lancaster. We meet at James Street Mennonite down in the city. It's open to anyone, and you can just find out about it at gardensgonenative.org. We place seating areas throughout so we can all relax and take in nature in various settings. We have a favorite spot for morning tea overlooking a small meadow in the side yard, a cool spot where we sit in the shade of the pines with our afternoon smoothies, and a friendly spot in the front yard where we greet neighbors walking up and down the street. And we all enjoy gathering around the table on the patio. The kids love the vine house and have lots of impromptu tea parties underneath the native wisteria, clematis, and honeysuckle that attract the birds, the bees and the hummingbirds and butterflies and moths. Pots can hold native plants. Here, Hooper Autumn Bride, also known as coral bells, did quite well on the patio and attracted many pollinators. And walls can be outfitted with plants. While the container in the first two pictures are actually filled with my grandmother's non-native sedum, which I knew would survive the heat of a south-facing brick wall, one also provided a nesting spot for some finches. So this year I plan to try planting them with butterfly weed, which I think might be able to tolerate the sun on that side. I'll also add here that our garden is a constant work in progress, and while we've committed to removing any plant on the invasive species list, we still have some non-native plants. Some are what I call memory plants, like my grandmother's sedum and Siberian irises, or this bleeding heart from a dear friend, and they get to stay. And others came with the house, and most of those that we've left are trees that offer privacy. So just beyond that tree on the right at the bottom, you can kind of see my neighbor's house next door. These plants are neither beneficial nor are they detrimental to creation. When I do a habitat assessment at people's yards, they're what we call neutrals. So, you know, they're okay, but like Dave says, they're taking up valuable real estate that could be used for native habitat. So hostas still line the paths under the white pines where we've had some difficulty finding native plants that do well. And since that picture was taken, I have to say that a lot of the area beyond the hostas has now filled in with wood aster and woodland poppies and a bunch of other native plants. So the hostas I've left because they are like a barrier for the kids stepping into the more delicate and fragile plants. But in one area, I removed them entirely because the native plants that are there are now hardy enough and have the borders delineated enough that they're not going to trample it. So let's see, I went the wrong way, sorry. And I'll confess to just be totally in love with hellebores or Lenten roses. They're evergreen foliage and flowers that begin blooming while snow is still on the ground, just giving me hope that spring's going to eventually arrive. And we have 3 small patches of these. And it's also just the first bloom that the kids look for in winter. So they get to stay. And while not a favorite tree of mine because of its lack of value for wildlife, the old cova on the right there that frames the path between our front yard and the side meadow so beautifully provides the shade needed for the shade-loving plants that we planted underneath. But I'll admit that we keep going back and forth as to whether we should let it stay or replace it with a native tree. Here's that Japanese maple that was pictured in the front yard. It's probably going to have to go when we finally install a patio there. But for now, it's a great organic hideout and climbing tree for the preschool set. One redeeming feature is that we do find a lot of cicadas in it. But there are very few exotic species in our garden that can't be replaced with a native plant that will be equally beautiful and infinitely more valuable for wildlife. We use a lot of shrubs to fill in the beds because they usually grow fairly quickly and shade out the weeds that might grow underneath. Children love to plant, but they really don't like to weed, and neither do we. And I'm sure none of you have that as a favorite hobby either. And then shrubs make great walls for garden rooms. So I want to put out that these are all 3 pictures of the same bed. This is when we planted it originally. This is what it looks like 3 years later. And here it is over here on the right. Look how big that tree has gotten. That's just 3 years growth in that composting method that we did. And there's really such a wide variety of bushes with interesting and varied foliage that bloom or change color throughout the year. You can see from these pictures of the same bed that you can have 4-season interest. So it's just the thing to keep your neighbors intrigued too. So here are spring and summer, fall and winter. And incidentally, these are pictures of a hedge that we created to give the children a boundary and keep them from running into the street. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to just share some random gardening snaps that I hope you're going to enjoy. And maybe you can draw on them for inspiration for your own garden. Try planting pumpkin or gourd seeds in a newly laid shrub garden where there's still lots of mulch between the plants. Because what's going to happen is the vines are going to meander around and the large leaves are going to suppress the weeds with additional pollinator-friendly flowers. And then you're going to get some fruit you need too. And while we're on the subject of pumpkins, we save those we use for fall decorations by placing them around the yard after Thanksgiving. And we let the wildlife enjoy the bounty through the winter. So obviously in this photo, the critters crashed the party before they were invited. But we were delighted that they made themselves at home. And after all, we have to remember that God put them here first, and it's really their home. They're here first, and I like to think that they're sharing their space with us. The grandkids absolutely delight in the feeding show. You can see the little squirrel out there popping into the pumpkin. Which leads me to point out that restoring habitat is not just a daytime project to be done in the spring or summer. The grandkids watch the erratic flight of the bats at night, and they chase fireflies. They listen to the concert of the nighttime insects and owls. And in the fall, they collect the leaves and pine straw that our neighbors place along the curb for pickup. And knowing they're rescuing a myriad of insects, they help us to place them as mulch in our own garden beds. In the winter, they fill our bird feeder and heated bird bath and put up suet cakes and peanut butter pine cones that they've made. They love to see the birds eating the berries and seeds off the plants they planted. And we're learning to identify birds together. Searching for birds' nests has been a Christmas time tradition of ours for years. They also love to identify animal tracks and are thrilled to find fox, squirrel, bird, and rabbit tracks in the garden. And keeping a nature journal helps them to remember what they have discovered. Making bouquets from native flowers is a beautiful way to bring a bit of the garden indoors. And we play a game taking turns hiding this little stake that has some dragonflies on it. The kids love trying to put it where they don't think we're going to be able to find it. And when it's our turn to hide it, we put it next to something we want them to notice. Like you can see in her hand, the first bloom of the dicentric zinnia last April. Compost is always fun. And a very simple but intriguing activity is to scoop a few shovels whole into a bucket and let them explore what's become of the kitchen scraps and leaves they've added to the pile. They love uncovering the decomposers they find. Centipedes tickle them as they crawl up their arms, and little roly-polies turn into balls in their hand, and then they just love watching the worms wiggle. On one rare occasion, a granddaughter, thrilled at an unusual find, painfully discovered the way that stag beetles protect themselves. But I must say, in the 9 years we've lived here, we've only experienced one bee sting. Most insects really will not bother you if you don't bother them. A great activity for kids is to give them magnifying glasses and a small patch of brown. Let them be a detective and discover what they can find. Lawns that haven't been treated with chemicals are like mini jungles, and leaf litter is just a winter resort of creatures waiting to be discovered. Consider it a safari. The grandchildren each planted trees they claim, not for ownership, they understand, but for stewardship. And during our Easter egg hunt one year, the kids were delighted to find rabbit droppings. And knowing that the minerals in the scat were necessary for butterflies, they spent a good deal of time gathering the droppings and adding them to our butterfly puddle, all while dressed in their Easter finery. Now, some of you may be wondering how the kids knew about the minerals in the scat. It turns out that poop is quite a great conversation starter. And we've had a number of discussions about the animal droppings they find in the yard. They're pleased when they can identify what kind of animal it came from, and sometimes they can even observe what was eaten. It's gross, but definitely intriguing. We have hopscotch in the woods under the native cherry trees. And where they've left a spot for birds to dust their feathers, the kids can dig to their heart's content. And that's an activity they never tire of. And it makes for a great place to play in the dirt as well. We delight in having the children come up with their own ideas to try to make something or do something in the garden. And providing it's safe and we have the materials, we let them give it a go. And if we don't have the materials, sometimes we buy it for the next time. Whether it's making a bee hotel, toad house, or teepee, it's fun to see them figure out what they need to do and make it happen and allow them the opportunity to try. And part of the solution might be to ask an adult for help if they've exhausted their own makeup strength or knowledge, or especially if it requires power tools. Tree climbing is always fun. And together we like to plan how to attract more wildlife. So creating this critter condo from old shelves and pavers that were in the garage was a quick and easy afternoon activity last fall. One very successful project that I thought would entertain them for about an hour was to make a fairy garden. We simply provided natural materials we gathered along our walks, as well as some corks from wine that we adults had enjoyed sitting on the patio. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know, do you all not do wine here?
Oh.
Okay. But we added a few glue guns to the mix, and then we just sat back and let their creative juices flow. So they spent all afternoon making houses, castles, and a whole bunch of little creatures. And they found a lot of elements from the garden to incorporate into their creations. We don't mind the little plastic fairies. I have nothing against that, but I would rather see them come up with their own creatures. And quite honestly, they do disintegrate. So every time they come over, it's another opportunity to create new critters. So what does this have to do with native habitats at Fairy Garden? Each time they visit, it's one of their favorite areas in which to play and imagine, all while being surrounded by insects humming, birds singing, and nature. And it's a rare day they don't come find us to have a listen to or a look at something they've discovered. We've turned unexpected disappointments into opportunities. An oak that fell during the storm years ago became a balance beam, and at the same time, a great habitat for all sorts of insects. When the power company took down 2 of our large white pines, we requested they leave one a snag, and it's now home to several creatures. They like to see if they can look in the hole and see who's living there. The kids made wreaths and Christmas decorations from the greens, and some of the branches became our teepee where the native vines can grow. Others were used to create the fur needed for our rain garden, and the rest filled the beds we prepared for what has become the native plant nursery using a modified hugelkultur method to retain the moisture. When the emerald ash borers killed all the trees along our driveway, we used the logs to make the base and the stairs of a fort. The kids call the grooves that were revealed when the bark was removed secret writing, and they pretend they're interpreting some kind of insect hieroglyphics. But they're also observing firsthand how the emerald ash borer got under the bark to kill the tree. And since our neighbor who shared the biggest tree with us preferred not to leave a snag, we had the arborist cut the trunk into various sized logs and arranged them into what has been dubbed the unicorn train by our toddler granddaughters. Not only do they run back and forth along the stumps and use them for tea parties, but they became a nice barrier between our newest garden bed and the path to the fort and fairy garden. And even great grandma gets drafted into playing in this natural habitat, my 90-year-old mother. Underneath the bricks in our native plant nursery are ant colonies and other insects that have found a home. And great horned owls occasionally take up residence in our trees, and the kids enjoy hooting back and forth at dusk. We especially enjoy the owlets that emerge in late winter or early spring. And finding owl and other bird feathers is always a special treat. But by far the most interesting activity is dissecting owl pellets. The children have a jar of various bones they've collected, with the prize being an intact squirrel skull. And one of our grandkids is especially intrigued with trying to identify the various bird and mammal bones. One time when we were roasting marshmallows after having fun dissecting owl pellets, one of the grandkids left an open-faced s'more on the picnic blanket. And so while Dave and I were keeping an eye on the fire, the baby crawled right through the marshmallow and just beyond to where we dissected those owl pellets. And she found herself tarred and feathered. So needless to say, we plopped her in the tub immediately. And having mallow growing in our garden, the kids know where the marshmallows they toast originated. They taste edible flowers, and some they find really tasty, like pumpkin blossoms and violets. And they're also learning which plants are poisonous to people and should be avoided, but are quite valuable to wildlife. We propagate by layering, cutting, and seed. And when the toddlers leave, we now say, "See you later, propagator," and they respond, "In a while, phytophile," which means plant lover. We've talked about the why, what, when, and how of creating habitat with kids. So now let's talk about the who and where. Whether you're a grandparent, a neighbor, a teacher, a community leader, or just someone who wants to encourage the next generation, you can make a difference in helping children to engage in restoring natural habitat. And no matter what amount of land you have, or whether you've had none at all, you can help kids provide natural habitat and wildlife. If you have a yard, I hope you'll turn it into a wildlife habitat, whether you have children or not in your life. I suggest starting small with one patch of lawn and a garden bed at a time. Just remove the exotic species and put in our valuable native plants instead. And don't bite off more than you can chew, because that's a sure recipe for disaster. You can, and I hope will, later expand the wildlife habitat in your yard. For us, it's become absolutely addictive. And every year we widen our beds and find new places to put another bed, although we're running out of space. Should you happen to live where you simply don't have space to create habitat at your own home, I'd encourage you to find a place in your neighborhood where you can get permission to do so and involve the community if you can. And these can include anything from schoolyards, libraries, and parks, to places of worship, to the little patch of land between the sidewalk and the road, or even containers in front of buildings or an area around an apartment sign. Once you set your mind to it, there's no end to the creative opportunities. In this age, when we're concerned with climate change and protecting God's creation, creating habitat can move children from feeling worried and helpless to giving them a vision of hope. And we are a people of hope. It allows them the opportunity to do something tangible to mitigate the problems that they may hear about. And they learn that if we want to take care of our brothers and sisters, we need to take care of all other living things on this earth as well. We're all interdependent. And like most things, this is done best by getting them involved rather than just talking about it. For us, the most gratifying times are when our grandchildren are anxious to share with us what they've discovered for themselves. And the best thing of all is that it happens while we're working, or rather playing, in our happy, healthy habitat with nature all around us. It inspires both calm and awe at the same time. And honestly, who doesn't feel better when they're surrounded by God's nature? And what better place to enjoy it than right where we live? In conclusion, I want to say restoring habitat can be a great activity where kids can have fun as they explore the wonders of nature. It's great for wildlife, helps reduce water and air pollution, contributes to the healing of our planet, and it's good for our own physical, mental, and spiritual health. It can also be very beautiful. And you'll be surprised how much the kids really enjoy doing this. The goal is to simply help children to fall in love with nature right outside their doors. And now I'd like to take just 5 minutes to read you the children's book I wrote about our experience. Its purpose is to offer a simple blueprint that shows how easy and fun it can be to restore natural habitat. It's illustrated by Duncan Robertson, who's a Virginia artist who happens to be my nephew. So here we go. It's called Grandma Lisa's Hummingbirds and Chirping Garden. It's autobiographical, and in all honesty, I wrote the book first, and then we went through this process with the kids. But after I'd only been in the house a couple of months, I was like, okay, this is what we're doing. So Grandma Lisa bought a house. It was near the city. And though the garden looked quite nice and really rather pretty, she knew at once things had to change. And this is why, you see, the garden there had little food for butterfly or bee. She started tearing out the plants. At first, it seemed quite wrong. She ripped out English ivy, and the vixen was gone. This burning bush just had to go. That butterfly bush, too. But Grandma, lots of butterflies just love it. Yes, they do. I know that, my sweet darling, but here's the rub, you see. They sip out all the nectar, and they're happy as can be. But they can't lay their eggs on it. When caterpillars hatch, they need specific leaves to eat. This bush is not a match. So we will add some other plants on which those creatures dine. Then caterpillar babies will have food to grow up fine. We started planting milkweed, some aster and black cherry. We planted willow, birch, and oak, and Grandma sure was merry. We planted things like violets that I had thought were weeds, but Grandma Lisa said they weren't. They're insect food indeed. We mostly planted native plants. That's their best food, you know. Then Grandma Lisa and we kids began to watch them grow. But Grandma, why do we need bugs? Don't they sting a bite? Well, if they must defend themselves, it's possible they might. If you do not bother them, they'll rarely bother you. And there are such important things our insect friends must do. They pollinate the crops we eat, the flowers, shrubs, and trees. The honey you spread on your toast is made by busy bees. When animals and plants die off, the bugs begin to toil. They decompose what's left of them to make the good rich soil. And many other animals eat bugs to stay alive. If bugs aren't in our garden, then those creatures can't survive. But all our lovely plants was just step number 1. We wanted other animals to come and join the fun. We knew they'd like the garden, but so that they would stay, we made a natural habitat where they could live and play. We put down rocks and stepping stones where salamanders hide, and made a birdhouse where the birds could raise their chicks inside. A pile of branches way out back gave little critters cover from hungry foxes, hawks, and owls when nearby they would hover. The stone wall made a nice home for a chipmunk family, and a funny little bumpy toad as cute as he could be. Some water filled a bird bath and a saucer on the ground, where birds could bathe and frogs and lizards gathered all around. We left a patch of dried up dirt for birds to dust their feathers, and a muddy place where butterflies could gather all together. And soon the creatures came around. What a splendid bunch! And then I noticed some of them ate others for their lunch. I really was quite worried that birds ate up the bugs, and hawks ate up the smaller birds, and toads ate up the slugs. The foxes caught the rabbits, and owls ate mice and voles if they couldn't scurry fast enough and hurry down their holes. But Grandma said, my dear, it's fine. No need to be appalled. It's just the way that nature works. A food web's what it's called. All creatures living on this earth must simply find a way to hunt for food and feed their young. It happens every day. And though to us it may seem cool, it's natural and okay that sometimes they're the predator and sometimes they're the prey. Her garden near the city now attracts a lot of bugs. They jump and fly and creep and crawl while Grandma gives us hugs. The butterflies and hummingbirds flit from flower to flower, and I could gladly watch the frogs and lizards for an hour. The birds feed on the insects, the bats eat the mosquitoes. The fireflies twinkle in the dark, my favorite kind of beetles. The toads and birds and other creatures make their special sounds. It's like a lovely concert with their noises all around. All day and night they sing their songs, and music fills the air. They hum and buzz and chirp and croak. I love just being there. The end. Thanks so much, you all, for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story and that you'll learn to follow the next generations of this generation. So thank you so much for inviting me here today, and it's been a pleasure. We have questions, okay?
Well, we're committed to native plants at our place.
Yay.
And recently, where do you get native plants? Well, we have the answer for people that live around here. 3 years ago, a native Hungry Hook farm native plants in Bainbridge started, and we were there recently and loaded up. And they have all kinds of information. They have native plants for shade, for sun, and do you know
Yeah,
that
Sherry
place?
Moyer, she's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, okay.
Yes, and so she's the close by. If you go to the Lancaster Conservancy's website, they have a list of native plant nurseries that don't use neonicotinoids. So neonicotinoids are a systemic insecticide that goes into, it can be put in soil, it can be coated on a seed, it can be sprayed on a plant. What it does is it stays in the plant for up to like 7 years, and every part of that plant becomes toxic. The pollen, the nectar, the leaves that the caterpillars eat, everything, the flowers. So if you buy a native plant from a nursery that's not certified neonicotinoid free, and I believe the Lancaster Conservancy has stickers now that they're starting to put just this year on nursery doors that are neonicotinoid free. What you're doing is you're actually buying a plant to help wildlife, but it ends up being a death trap. The same thing goes for trees. Most people don't realize that when you plant a tree, an oak tree is the best tree to plant because it hosts 522 different kinds of caterpillars, of butterflies, and moths. And if you have green lawn under it, what happens when those leaves fall down? If you don't just leave the leaves where they are, there's no place for the insects to go. 95% of insects overwinter in leaf litter, either as an adult, a pupa, so by leaving our leaves, and what we do is we just, like you saw in the video, we steal our neighbor's leaves off the curb with their permission. In fact, my next door neighbor's like, "You sure you want these leaves?" And I'm like, "Bring them over," so it's easier for him to put them in our yard than to drag them to the curb. So anyway, but that's a really important thing, is to make sure it should be as far out as the leaf canopy goes. But what we've done is we've just taken those areas and turned them into garden beds. You don't have to do anything. You can just leave the leaves. But we planted native plants. The Fothergill is planted underneath our maple. Golden ragwort is a workhorse. It will grow anywhere. Sun, shade. It's growing along our maple roots where nothing else would grow. Capra aurea is the Latin name. So, and that's another thing. Be sure when you're buying a plant, ask for it by its Latin name. And again, the Conservancy you can find it at National Wildlife Federation. My book actually has, in the back, it has a glossary because there's some talk words. But it also has where to find the kind of plants that grow in your area. And I list 2 websites, Audubon and National Wildlife Federation. But you want to plant what grows in your area specifically. We have a great native plant movement here in Pennsylvania. So, but if you don't ask for it by the Latin name, you may get an Asian plant. I went to buy bearberry for a shady spot with hard soil. And I'm reading the tag and it says, I bought bearberry, it was labeled native. And it said, requires loamy soil and full sun. And I'm like, what? So I looked at the Latin name and I had indeed bought an Asian one that was labeled native. So when you go to I recommend native plant nurseries. We have a lot of good ones around here. I mean, when I lived in Virginia before moving here, I'd have to drive hours to find a native plant nursery. Here, within a half an hour of my house in Lancaster, there's several. So anyway, yeah, the Lancaster Conservancy is a great resource. So we're probably out of time.
Yeah, I
But,
think we probably are.
okay,
The other one, like if you're buying bulk, is ISIL, because I go
Yes.
on that. And like what you said about
mhm,
planning out a small thing, I had set out a goal
Yeah.
to remove all this invasive. I think I got a quarter of it done to the body set.
yeah,
That's it for the summer.
yeah, right. So ISO comes in little tiny,
Yeah.
they're called landscape plugs. What I actually do is I have that permaculture bed, my native plant nursery, I get them from ISO. I let them grow for a year in really good soil that I've made from my compost, in a garden bed like you would for vegetables. And then they get strong and I transplant them next year. So they're like what you would buy for $9 at the nursery.
Right.
So anyway, but I think just to cap it off with this group, caring for God's creation is something that is really important and now more than ever. So I appreciate that your church is doing this. So,
Thanks,
thank
Lisa.
you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Do you know Melody from